But perhaps we should nonetheless consider the possibility that the blurring of the lines between civilian and military spheres in turn marks perhaps a deeper and more insidious form of militarism, one that might be most obvious in the United States. The Cold War might not have produced a major interstate war, but the superpower rivalry and the ever-present threat of nuclear war led to an unprecedented degree of peacetime mobilization within US society. The US experienced huge defense budgets and the maintenance of very large standing armies, navies and air forces, with major wars in Korea, Vietnam, and interventions across the world. At the same time, a vast national security bureaucracy was created, lodged in the Department of Defense, the CIA, and the National Security Agency. An array of Pentagon-funded laboratories were also established. Various research organizations and think tanks developed. And of course, we saw the erection of a permanent arms industry. Previously, after the major wars, demobilization took place. After the First World War, there was a large-scale demobilization of society, whereby arms industries were closed and there was a return to a civilian economy. Demobilization of sorts occurred after the Second World War, but nothing like previous forms of demobilization. It was now necessary, in the context of the Cold War and the threat of imminent nuclear war, to have a military presence and a military readiness that would have to continue through peacetime. All of this concerned various individuals, including President Eisenhower, who in 1961 delivered a famous farewell address in which he pointed to the existence of a military-industrial complex and of the potential influence that such a complex could have. It's worth noting that an early draft spoke of a military-industrial congressional complex, but it seems that Eisenhower removed reference to Congress because of political sensitivities. But in fact, that was probably a more accurate formulation because it captured the various mutual interests, revolving doors involved in an alignment of the interests of the military as an institution, various sectors of industry who could generate large amounts of money through supply to the military, and the various congressional figures who either would act as lobbyists for industry or the military, or had vested interests in the persistence of military spending due to very large industrial installations in their congressional areas, and therefore on the employment that rested on it, and therefore of their electoral prospects. The end of the Cold War had promised a peace dividend. We were told and may discuss that in 1990, the fact that in the absence of a superpower rivalry, much of the extravagant spending of the Cold War could be reined in, and optimism was strong that this might be the grounds for a truly post-military era. And it's certainly true if we look at spending that after the end of the Cold War, spending fell, but not to a great extent, and soon began to build up again into the 21st century, especially, of course, after the events of 9/11. And so some would contend, such as Andrew Bacevich, that rather than a post-military era, we are rather in an era of a new American militarism. What would be the signs of that American militarism? Well, one would be the defense budgets. In 2010, the US national security spending reached almost $1 trillion a year, with about $700 million on strictly defense aspects. The defense budget of this period was 25% above the Cold War average, despite the fact there was no real peer competition. So in 2010, the US did not face a major superpower that was reined against it such as the Soviet Union, and yet was spending 25% more than it did during the Cold War. This is, of course, in adjusted dollars. And of course, there's been also a very strong growth in homeland security expenditure in the context of the war on terror. It's also worth noting that the US military explicitly strives for what it calls full spectrum dominance, with the ability to dominate the airs, the land, the seas, cyberspace, even, of course, outer space itself, and with that to cultivate a global force projection. This explains, of course, why the US spends more than several of its next major competitors combined. And in terms of global projection, it possesses around 800 US bases located in 30 other countries. The United States has a capability for global projection that no other state possesses. And the US, of course, has made abundant use of this force, and indeed shown an increased propensity to do so. Between 1945 and 1988, the US was involved in 6 large military actions: in Korea, in Lebanon twice, in Vietnam, in the Dominican Republic, and in Grenada. Since 1989, the US has been involved in 11 large military actions in Panama, Iraq, Kurdistan, Somalia, Haiti, Bosnia, Kosovo, Afghanistan, Iraq again, Libya, and Iraq, Syria again, in the context of the Syrian civil war and the rise of Islamic State. And of course, this doesn't include various cruise missile attacks, drone strikes, and quasi-military dispatches of general infantry. So there is a sense that the US has actually become, since the end of the Cold War, much more willing and capable to conduct military operations. If we think about the setting of the war on terror, what we have seen is an American legislature that has relinquished its constitutional power over the decision to go to war. It has effectively granted open-ended war powers to the president. Indeed, in September 2001, the Congress passed the Authorization for Use of Military Force Against Terrorists, an act that is still being used today to legitimize actions undertaken under the heading of the war on terror. So this nebulous concept of the war on terror now allows the American executive, the White House, in effect, and the Department of Defense, to engage in military operations without ever having to go back to Congress to ask for permission. It simply can point to an act that was implemented in September 2001 and to argue, however tenuously, that whatever they are engaging in is in the context of a war on terror. It might also be possible to speak of, or necessary to speak of, a new military-industrial complex. So when we think of the traditional military-industrial complex, we think principally of large arms manufacturers. But today we see a new set of companies playing an increasing role within the military, and they're not the companies we usually think of, namely the companies of the Silicon Valley and the IT giants. Whether they're providing cloud services, big data, or AI technology, it is now companies such as Google, Microsoft, or Amazon who are the technological leaders and the major contractors. A few years ago, Google was famously involved in so-called Project Maven, which was a project by which Google would sell some of its AI capabilities to allow video recognition software to be applied to drone and various aerial footage. There were internal dissent within Google that forced the company to withdraw from this project, but it was in a sense quite revealing. Less conflicted has been Amazon, whose Amazon Web Services, the biggest provider of web space in the world, has been eyeing military contracts and involved in military contracts for quite a long time now. Only last year it did battle with Microsoft for the so-called Jedi Cloud project, a $10 billion contract, yes, $10 billion, a $10 billion contract in which would prepare and deliver a cloud infrastructure for all the information contained or held by the Department of Defense. Amazon eventually lost out, it is thought, what is said, due to the animosity of President Trump to Jeff Bezos, Amazon's CEO. But regardless, this is indicative of the kinds of new markets that are opening up and the seriousness with which a company like Amazon takes these markets, takes the opening of these markets. And this, of course, is something that the general public is mostly unaware of, does not think of Amazon as a defense company. It's also worth noting, of course, that in the United States, the armed forces are typically thought of as the most respected national institution. I mean, in a country that today suffers from a huge discredit of its institutions and quite considerable defiance towards its state, the military typically is seen as the competent bearer of moral values in an institution beyond criticism. You can criticize political leaders, you can criticize the decision to go to war, but you must, once you're in a war, absolutely unrestrictedly support the troops. And a lot of fanfare is made in order to show these public demonstrations of support to the troops, some of which is quite carefully engineered. In 2015, a senatorial investigation showed that the Department of Defense had paid American sports teams tens of millions of dollars to put on displays celebrating the military. Others would point to a new aesthetic of war, that of a sanitized, high-tech war, a spectator sport war. One might think of the notion of Stahl's notion of militainment, or James Derrin's military-industrial media entertainment network, a convergence of the military and the military-industrial complex with the entertainment culture and industry. In some sense, one might point back to Vietnam and its lessons. The military understood that it had lost the fight for the public representation of the war, and obviously did so in a context where it could not apply the forms of censorship that had been possible in the first half of the 20th century. So the military has made a lot of effort to court and manage the media. You can no longer dictate what the media has to say, but you can shape it by controlling the flow of information and media-friendly images, by embedding reporters into armed forces so that reporters have to follow a war inside the military units, whereby they're much more liable to report favorably on troops who are on a daily basis responsible for protecting their lives. High-tech war has also tended to produce, certainly from the air, a sanitized version of war, where the language becomes one of surgical strikes and collateral damage, high-tech imagery, drone images and so forth that remove the blood and gore from war. There has also been a concerted attempt to make disappear any dead American soldiers. For a time, the United States banned any footage, any images of American coffins, bodies coming back from war in Iraq and Afghanistan. This had to be concealed from the public, not shown on screen. Stahl also discusses the role of the citizen spectator, where the citizen is no longer required to actively participate in the war effort, but merely to acquiesce support through the passive consumption of media spectacle. And here we might want to think about how much military content, how much military messaging is reproduced in contemporary entertainment, particularly in films and in television. Something that the US military has put a lot of effort into notably by providing props for films that feature military equipment. So if you want to include American planes or battleships or any presence of the US military in your film, the Pentagon will review your script, and if it doesn't like what's in the script, if it doesn't think the script paints the US military in a positive light, then it will deny this support. So in doing so, it ensures a positive coverage of the military by Hollywood. But this citizen spectator is increasingly supplemented by an interactive engagement via the simulated thrills of video games, which prompts Stahl to talk about the virtual citizen soldier. Here we have a ad from a campaign for the video game Call of Duty that suggests that there's a soldier in all of us, that we can vicariously experience the thrills of war through video game entertainment. And it's striking the extent to which the military has come to borrow from video game imagery for its own recruitment. On the left we have the cover for Call of Duty Advanced Warfare, and on the right we have a recruitment poster for the Air Force which says it's not science fiction. There is very much a similar imagery at play, and a use of recruitment messaging that suggests that if you enjoy the video games and the thrills of high-tech war that are presented there, you can experience the real thing if you join. Another interesting convergence or emulation is the way in which improvised head-mounted footage, through the use of GoPro cameras for instance, has now increasingly made its way onto the internet in a manner that is obviously reminiscent of the first-person shooting view of most or many military video games. So that, again, a new aesthetic, one that is not the aesthetic of Hollywood, but the aesthetic of the gamer, of video games, has made its way into the way in which we mediate war today. So summing up, we perhaps find ourselves at a complicated time in terms of assessing the relationship of the military to civilian society. Militarism, recall, was associated to the total mobilization of society for war, in a context where traditional martial values were considered to be preeminent. Now that seems to be gone. We no longer live in societies that are fully mobilized for total war, and traditional martial values are not, certainly unambivalently, held up for admiration. But on the other hand, it's unclear that we live in post-military societies. There are many ways in which the military is still intertwined in our lives in lots of visible and not so visible way, to the extent that some would be tempted to speak of a new kind of militarism, one that is more subtle than the one that came before, but no less implicates us no less in the exercise of violence in the world today.